In the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls, we encounter a personage referred to as the teacher of righteousness, or the righteous teacher, or some such translation. He is a revered leader who holds great religious authority, having especially the ability to interpret scripture and prophecy. We hear of his enemies, a wicked priest, a scoffer, a liar, if indeed these are not the same villain. Betrayed, the righteous teacher leads his followers, or some section of them, to the land of Damascus, which location itself seems to have its source in a unique reading of prophecy. We had in fact met this character, the righteous teacher, before. Portions of the so-called Damascus document, also known at the time as the Zadokite document, a medieval copy in fragments, had been found in the 1890s in Cairo. We didn't know what to make of it at the time, but with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we finally understood its context and could place it in a broader literature. The story of the righteous teacher and his exile in Damascus did penetrate the Middle Ages, even though the figure is unknown in rabbinic and Orthodox Jewish sources. There was the question, right from the moment the scrolls were uncovered, of whether this mysterious teacher of righteousness might prefigure or even be the character known as Jesus, and perhaps the liar, the scoffer, the bad guy, is the figure known to us as Judas Iscariot. This on the basis of a rough similarity of stories. The idea was quickly dismissed, and the thrust of scholarship has been to place the righteous teacher in the earlier intertestamental period, or even as far back as the Maccabean Revolt. There are few parallels between the two figures, beyond the general family resemblance of a popular religious teacher and sectarian schisms. There is no mention of the righteous teacher being martyred or crucified or anything like that, and Jesus never goes to Damascus with his followers. There's no episode of exile in the Gospels. The two figures would seem to be unrelated. The other proposal was that this righteous teacher might be related to or be the figure we know as John the Baptist. The righteous teacher is never named, and yet he was a significant figure. Where is he in our history? There is a much stronger parallel, a family resemblance, however, in that late and most disreputable apocryphal gospel, the Gospel of Barnabas. This medieval work has many strange variations on the canonical Jesus narrative. One of them is that the Jesus of the Barnabas Gospel goes to Damascus with his followers in exile, and is prompted to do so by his betrayal by Judas Iscariot. That is, there is a much stronger, we might even say a close match between this version of the Jesus narrative and the story of the righteous teacher. The Gospel of Barnabas contains many non-canonical insertions into the Gospel stories. One of them is an episode in a place called Nain. It's based on the story in the Gospel of Luke, found at 7:11 in Luke. In Barnabas, the people of Nain want to make Jesus king. Jesus rejects this, but Judas Iscariot is disappointed. He wanted Jesus to be king so that he would become a powerful man, we are told, and he decides to betray Jesus. At this juncture, Jesus flees to Damascus and is soon joined by his followers, 36 disciples. This is, technically speaking, a so-called small Sanhedrin, the full Sanhedrin being 72. Nothing much happens at Damascus, though. Jesus gives a short sermon on death where he says that death is merely a state of exile. Judas Iscariot turns up, fawns over Jesus, and Jesus says, "Let us return to Galilee." It is an unexplained and uneventful sojourn in Damascus. Again, the relevant elements are, in this version, Jesus goes to Damascus with his followers in exile, the subject of his sermon, and is forced to do so by the betrayal of Judas Iscariot, one of his own. On any reading of the Damascus document and other sectarian literature found in the Dead Sea caves, the main elements of the story are the righteous teacher goes to Damascus with his followers in exile and is forced to do so by the betrayal of one or more of his own. As I say, a strong family resemblance, cousins at least. There is much more in the Gospel of Barnabas, though, which often interacts intertextually with the canonical Gospels and other sources in remarkable ways. We have to put aside the notion that the medieval Barnabas is a worthless and vexatious forgery by a renegade convert to Islam who pulled errant stories straight from his imagination. We do not know its history or its sources or its author, but it surely draws on previous sources. It is a compilation of various materials, we can tell, and it often participates in meaningful intertextual rearrangements of gospel stories. It seems to belong in the tradition of medieval diatessaira, gospel harmonies. The motif of kingship, the people of Nain want to make Jesus king, is fascinating in this case. On the face of it, what it means is that there was a popular movement seeking to elevate this charismatic religious leader to political power, and he rejected this role. Some of his followers were disappointed by this and turned against him. He had to flee in exile. It is an entirely plausible scenario just as a political drama in itself. It's a coherent story. It seems to be related to a story in Josephus's Jewish Wars. This is the only non-Christian work in which a place called Nain is mentioned, our only independent historical reference for such a place. Josephus places it far to the south, not in Galilee like Luke and the Christian tradition. It was a stronghold of a messianic pretender called Simon, Josephus relates. And he says that the people of Nain treated this Simon, quote, like a king, unquote. The Barnabas story surely cannot be unrelated to that. The canonical story in Luke, set in this place called Nain, is about raising the widow's son. No mention of kings. Nain and kings go together because they go together in Josephus. In the canonical Gospels, see Mark 1:35 and Luke 4:42, there is an episode where Jesus quietly leaves Capernaum and makes his way to a, quote, lonely place. In Mark's account, it is the character called Simon who goes to look for him, noting that name in Josephus. The Barnabas story also seems related somehow to the medieval works of Juan Alonso of Spain. He presents a very strange retelling of the story of Oedipus Rex that features a King Jesus of Damascus. But in that story, this King Jesus of Damascus flees to Judea into exile for inadvertently marrying his mother. The Gospel of Barnabas participates in a swirl of intertextuality. But more specifically, and following this to its ultimate source, the kingship motif follows from the proof text used explicitly by the Dead Sea Scrolls. There is no account of the righteous teacher being or aspiring to be a king, or of his followers imposing that expectation upon him, as happens to the Barnabas Jesus. So we might think this is a point where the two stories don't match. But the righteous teacher story is based in a prophecy in Amos, which reads, I will exile the tabernacle of your king, and the bases of your statues from my tent to Damascus. The sectarian scrolls deploy a creative interpretation of this prophecy to show that righteous teacher's exile to Damascus was prophecy being fulfilled. But notice, I will exile the tabernacle of your king. Here then, explicitly, in the very proof text, is the motif of kingship connected to the exile to Damascus. So on this point, the medieval Gospel of Barnabas agrees once again with the Dead Sea Scrolls material. And I also point out that the Gospel of Barnabas has a specific interest in the prophecies of Amos. To recap, the elements in the Gospel of Barnabas are kingship, betrayal, exile, Damascus. All of these elements are there in the story of the righteous teacher. He is not a king, but his exile to Damascus, the entire story, is based in the prophecy of Amos, which refers to a king. These elements are all assembled in the Barnabas author's reworking of the Jesus story. It is, as I say, a simple matter of family resemblance. How it has come to occur is another question. But what is most notable nonetheless is that here we have a work in which the righteous teacher of the scrolls is matched to the character we call Jesus, an implicit identification, but a clear parallel. This is not to say that the Barnabas author knew the story of the righteous teacher, but he received a tradition in which Jesus is a parallel figure to the righteous teacher. Somebody, anyway, has understood Jesus to be the righteous teacher and has crafted a corresponding extra-canonical episode in which, accordingly, Jesus goes into exile in Damascus with his followers in a drama of political intrigue and betrayal. This should be enough to recommend the Gospel of Barnabas to at least a second reading. On the face of things, it often seems comical in a medieval way. But the reconstructions of the Jesus narrative and the work are in reality fascinating and suggestive and revealing. Standard accounts of the Gospel of Barnabas, especially those of Christian apologists keen to depict it as worthless, merely point to the Damascus episode as evidence that the Barnabas author did not know his geography and explain it as a piece of medieval pastiche. But the patterns of the story are in fact familiar to us from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the story of the exile of the righteous teacher based in the prophecy of Amos. And it is only because the Barnabas Gospel is remote in time and so obviously a medieval production and such a weird work and such an unlikely place to find material that might reflect upon the Dead Sea Scrolls that we fail to see the resemblance. It's on the basis of this depiction in the Barnabas Gospel, late and disreputable though it is, the most spurious of Apocrypha, that I hazard the view that the character Jesus in the canonical narrative is not unrelated to the figure called the righteous teacher, and that the righteous teacher has served as a model, in part at least, for the canonical Jesus, and for the production of at least some parts of the Jesus tradition.